And so, on to this evening's events, if you like. Our first speaker this evening is Chris Mark. Chris is currently the head of the Department of Music and Sound Recording at the University of Surrey. His publications include articles and book chapters written on Britain, on whom he has also written a book, Elgar and Tippett. More recently, however, Chris has written a book on Roger Smalley, and hence, I'm sure you can all imagine our delight when Chris kindly accepted this faraway invitation, travelling all the way from the UK to speak at this evening's event. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chris Mark.
Thank you, Darryl. I'd like to say what a great honour it is to be invited to contribute to Roger's retirement event. I'm very grateful to the department and also to the university for their hospitality. So we come to what Roger himself has been describing as the eulogy. A couple of days ago, just after I arrived, he said to me, "How's the eulogy going?" And I was slightly taken aback by this because musicologists don't really like to be directed in that kind of way. They do, after all, try to have some sort of level of critical detachment. So I said to Roger, "Well, are you sure that's what it's going to be?" Well, yes, in a setting like this, then obviously there is going to be some eulogising going on. Okay, so let's get on with the eulogy. As I said, I'm very pleased to be invited to this event. In a sense, it's a slightly odd invitation in that I've had no formal connection with the University of Western Australia. I've never actually taught here. I gave my first seminar here only a couple of days ago. It's actually my first visit to the school. So I'm not part of the UWA community that is saying farewell to Roger. What I can provide, though, and what I think I've been invited to provide, I think, is an outsider's view of what the university is losing in terms of compositional accomplishment and musicianship in general, born of studying Roger's music in some detail for around 15 years or so. I use the word outsider, but of course I do know Roger fairly well. So genuine objectivity or detachment is impossible. But as all the most blinkered post-structuralists must now surely recognise, this is the case for everything that musicologists study and performers perform. Our attachment to, admiration for, specific pieces of music is what motivates and sustains our study and performance of them. This doesn't indicate a lack of critical engagement. And indeed, we'd be doing any composer's professionalism a disservice, and particularly Roger's a disservice, if that were the case. And certainly the book that I've recently finished on Roger's music attempts to assess as well as to explicate. My own attachment to Roger's music began as a postgraduate student studying Britain in the early 1980s. Though it's possible, I can't actually remember, but it's possible, in fact it's probable that I'd heard his electronic group intermodulation on the radio before that time. I remember hearing Roger talking in a Radio 3 programme about his relocation to Perth and the early pieces that were written here, such as the symphony, for example, and the Concertstück for violin and orchestra. And I certainly heard these when they were broadcast, possibly as promenade concerts. I think certainly the symphony was performed in a promenade concert. And I was very impressed. I was impressed by the lyricism of the music, the way in which it drew you in, and also the sense of the rightness of the notes. Now, the business of the rightness of the notes is absolutely central for me at that time, and indeed still is. In much post-World War II music, as I'm sure much of you will also have experienced, there's often a sense that the notes can be swapped around without much change in general effect. Which isn't necessarily to say that it's bad music. That might be exactly what the composer is intending. But I like my individual notes actually to be doing work and to know what that work is. And this is the impression that I got with Roger, that the notes actually meant things, specific things. I came to Australia myself in 1986 to teach at the University of Melbourne, and it was here that I reacquainted myself with the symphony. Soon after arrival, I bought the CD of the symphony and the piano concerto. You might remember that the piano concerto, or the concerto for piano orchestra, which is its proper title, had just won a prestigious award in France, I think. And immediately I heard that the qualities that I'd previously felt to be there were confirmed. And I was particularly struck, I remember, by the ending of the symphony, in which one particular note, pitch, F sharp, emerges, on top of which earlier parts of the work return in fragmented form. Now, the effect is really impossible fully to appreciate from an excerpt, but I'm going to play just the end of the symphony and hope that some of the power of the piece is apparent. And then after we've heard it, I'll say a little bit more about it. I don't know whether you could distinguish it in that recording, which is a tape of a recording, but that final F sharp is sustained by a wine glass playing that particular note. It's a very special kind of sound. The whole piece was in memoriam piece. It was for Pauline Steele, who was somebody who'd lost her life quite young. And it seemed to me that this was a piece which was written by a composer who was originally an avant-garde composer, and yet it had this enormous emotional impact to it, which I felt was very impressive. But it was actually the piano concerto that I began to take apart in the sense of trying to work out how it was put together, how Roger put it together. And this was simply because in the same shop where I bought the CD, Fine Music, I think it was, in Melbourne, they had a score. It was one of the Australian Music Centre facsimiles. And it was a fascinating piece. Intricate structures on various different levels, beautifully organised. All of Roger's organisational capital, we can say, is spent on his music, I think. You may very well respond in that way. I couldn't possibly comment. Most of all, the piece made very good audible sense. Again, I come back to this. There was very little sign of post-Darmstadtian constructivist self-indulgence and narcissism. It wasn't possible to follow audibly absolutely every process he employs, just as it isn't possible to keep track of the intricacies of every Bach fugue, or every late Beethoven quartet, or every Wagner opera. But it's very rare that one cannot point to some clear musical reason why he has done what he has done in the music. Again, to non-musicians, this might seem to be an odd thing to be saying, but much late 20th century and indeed early 21st century music seems to me to be mired in rather esoteric pattern manipulation, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what you can actually hear. Now, the determination that all compositional business should be aimed to audible effects is very well demonstrated by the opening of the piano concerto. And I just want to say a little bit about this. It involves one or two sort of technical comments, which I hope will be, the whole point of it really is that they will be followable. Now, the basic material at the beginning here consists of a number of chords which one would hear in Bach, in Beethoven, etc. So the first chord that you're going to hear is, I get to play this now. The first chord that you get to hear is an A major one, quite loud you'll find. That's followed by a G sharp minor one, so there's a major triad followed by a minor one. Then, let me remember, what do we have after that? It's an augmented triad built on D. So they all sound a little bit different. Then there's a diminished seventh. Then there's another major chord, B major. And then finally, F minor. Underpinning all of that, you'll hear this pattern. Now that's a very important pattern which I'll be coming back to in a minute, but the interesting thing about it is that the intervals gradually widen. So you start off with one semitone down, then two semitones up, then three semitones down, four semitones, five. And so if you were to go on, then you'd have six after that. So there are those chords which are very familiar, but they're used in a very unfamiliar kind of way. Each chord is allotted a duration so that it repeats after a certain number of beats. And, well, let's hear what the overall effect is. As I say, it begins with quite a loud chord, so you need to be ready for that. It's the A major one. Again. Very carefully constructed and worked out in advance. It doesn't sound like that, and you can actually hear what's going on. And it has this overall effect of, well, a machine cranking up, I think. It's not possible for the human mind to follow absolutely everything that's going on, but the overall effect is very clear. So I delivered a seminar on this concerto at the University of Melbourne, and then I wrote to Roger asking whether or not I could see some sketches. To see whether what I thought was going on was actually what was going on. And more or less, I think it was, actually. And when I contacted him, he asked me to supply a written-up version for the book Poles Apart, which was published in celebration of his 50th birthday. So obviously my appetite was whetted, and a book seemed the next logical step. Now, it's not appropriate for me to list or summarize the book's contents here, but I thought what would be appropriate would be, first of all, to identify some of the key characteristics of the music written during his time at UWA, say something about the importance, as far as can be determined by an outsider, of UWA and Perth in general on his compositional development, and say something about what I think is his significance as a composer. I haven't really seen what he's been doing in terms of performer, teacher, etc., so I'll leave others to comment upon that. Now, the first two of these things, key characteristics and the influence of UWA and Perth, are pretty much inextricably connected, it seems to me, because coming to Perth led to, first of all, Roger's recognition of deep fundamental dissatisfaction with the compositional approach that he'd adopted up to that point, but also a route, after a lot of hard thinking, because it took him a number of years, out of what appeared to be an impasse. As several of you probably know from reading published interviews and so on, Roger recognized that he was being presented with a different audience from the one that he'd been used to writing for, and this presented, first of all, difficulties, but also, more importantly, I think, opportunities. The difficulties were the lack of an audience knowledge of the works and the repertoire that had been formative to him. So his audience here didn't really know, he felt, the kind of background to the pieces that he'd been writing previously. But he saw this really as being an opportunity of developing a language that would, first of all, draw on the audience's experience, whilst also offering something new, and also give him as a composer a stylistic and technical basis that could be gradually enriched. Roger himself once said to me that he felt that his position was rather like that of Haydn at Esterházy. Now, when Haydn was employed at Esterházy, it was a very remote place. There were musicians sort of coming through now and then, but he mostly had to write for the bands that was employed there. He didn't have an opportunity to travel all that much, and so Haydn said that because of this isolation, he was forced to become original. And I think that there's something of a parallel with Roger there too. So the first fruits of this change of direction was his music theatre piece, William Derrincourt, which shows straight away him buying into the Australian life that he was now leading with the choice of this particular topic. Now, because of its historical placement in the past, there was a need for various historical references. He had to write a waltz and so on. And this led to what he has described as a broadening of his stylistic palette. And it was the first of his works to reintroduce those common chords that we've just heard at the beginning of the piano concerto. But just as important, I think, was the emergence at the end of the work, in the final scene, of a pattern of notes that was to form the basis for most of his music for the next decade. Now, again, this is sort of slightly technical, but I do just want to mention it briefly, simply because it demonstrates something which is characteristic of Roger, and it says something about how he works. It's a form of notes which has particular properties, which I won't go into in great detail, but I will just sort of go over it. And then we'll hear this last scene in a minute. So you remember the wedge shape in the piano concerto, which moves first with one semitone, then two, then three, etc., like this. Well, here he uses something similar, but with that pattern moving in one direction rather than two, so that, for example, the tune that I'm going to be playing you begins again with one semitone and then two. So there's one, then two, three, four, five, then six, etc. He actually moves, because no, but that goes without anybody's singing range, so he turns it in on itself a little bit, so you get this instead. etc., etc., etc. Just about all of Roger's pieces for the next decade or so are based on that pattern of notes in one way or another. And it seems to me that it's the sign of an extremely fertile mind that most of his audience would have been listening to those pieces without recognizing this fact, that he can find so many different ways of using such a straightforward and simple set of notes. You will have noticed, by the way, that we've also already heard that tune. It was what the solo cello was playing at the end of the symphony. So that's another instance of the use of that particular set of notes. And this is something else about Roger's music, is that he's constantly reusing the same material. Okay, so let's listen to this final scene then of William Derrincourt. I have one other taped excerpt to play, and that is the ending of the oboe concerto. It seems to me you can often tell the quality of a composer's from their endings. The oboe concerto represents really the next phase of Roger's composition, the phase in which he based music on the chromatically rich passages from Chopin mazurkas, and then later on from passages from Brahms and Schumann, and indeed later on, still, from his teachers, John White and Peter Racine Fricker. But I also want to mention it because it's actually the only Smalley first performance that I've been to, that I've managed to get to. Three things stand out in mind from this occasion. First of all, there was the obvious rapport between both the orchestra, with whom he obviously got on very well, and also the audience. He gave a pre-concert talk, and then the next day there were several people who were coming up to him. I remember we were in an art gallery, and there were people coming up to him saying, you know, I liked the piece, and so on. And Roger turned to me and said, well, there you are, you see what I mean. By which he meant it's somewhere where he genuinely felt that he was part of a community. The second thing that struck me was how he got away with wearing a Mickey Mouse tie. Now, I mean, there could have been several reasons why Roger was wearing a Mickey Mouse tie. I mean, literally a tie that had Mickey, what's the plural? Mickey Mouses, I suppose, on it. This was a performance that was sponsored. He had to go and talk to the sponsors at the interval and so on. From a distance, it would look like a posh tie, I mean, rather like this one, possibly. But when he got close, it was very obvious what it was. Actually, there's a serious point that I'm about to make about this, and that is about subversiveness. It seems to me that Roger is essentially a subversive character. Those of you who have had a chance of reading any of his music criticism will know this. Most of his criticism was published before he came to Australia. Those of you who have had access through the university or whatever to JSTOR, if you go through back issues of the Musical Times and just type in Roger Smalley, there'll be a very large number of critiques of performances, discs and so on, and it is trenchant criticism. He had very strong views, still does have very strong views. But also, he's subversive in his music. The opening of the piano concerto, for example, is essentially subversive. He's using familiar material in unfamiliar circumstances. He's subverting audience expectations. They're supposed not to expect a big A major chord at the beginning, for example. And again, this suggests parallels, I think, with composers like Haydn. Long may he remain subversive, I would say. The third point, the third thing that impressed me was, of course, the music itself. There's an extraordinary poignancy and poise, I think, in the final stretch, which we're going to listen to in a minute. The lack of firm closure is not, as one wag put it after the concert to Roger, because he'd run out of time again, but because this is exactly the kind of ending that the material and its formal treatment demands. So let's hear the end of that. It's a reasonably compact work. I can't remember exactly how long it is, 20 minutes, 25 minutes possibly at the most. But it is extraordinarily rich, and I think one of the finest works written by anyone anywhere during the later years of the last century. To end the eulogy, I thought I'd read out the epilogue to the book as it currently stands. It's actually quite short. It's written largely for a UK and US audience, I think, but not entirely so. Reviewing Anthony Payne's completion of the sketches for Elgar's Third Symphony, and taking note of the degree of enthusiasm with which audiences received it, Robin Holloway writes, "Could elaboration like Payne's be achieved in the absence of an actual cause, such as a master's unfinished opus from an epoch of well-understood musical language? Elgar's Fourth and Rachmaninoff's, Mahler's 11th and 9th from Sibelius, just for a start, before reaching back to Tchaikovsky, Schumann, Mozart, Monteverdi, Josquin. The uncertain idioms of difficult modern music, together with its palpable failure to gain popular acceptance, have much to learn from the enormous sigh of welcome raised by such essentially nostalgic work of reclamation and replication. It might enable many current composers to come clean and dare to write the music that they, too, have secretly preferred all along. It might liberate embargoed knowledge and unstrangulate expressive gold." Unquote. Much space could be taken up discussing whether those composers engaged with the project of high modernism in the 50s, 60s and 70s were indeed binding themselves tightly to the mast and stopping their ears in order to pursue a cause they believed to be demanded by the historical moment, whilst really wanting to write Rachmaninoff. There is no doubt, though, that Smalley, like others such as Ligeti and Jonathan Harvey, revelled, after he had given himself permission, in the new access to the sheer sonority of the triad, to take one example of the expansion of his palette that Smalley himself refers to, as well as the straightforward tunefulness that had been regarded as off-limits, and which we've just heard in abundance in Roger's music. There seems little doubt that the possibility of appealing to a wider audience played its part in all this. But if Smalley's works are to continue to find and build an audience, it would not, I would suggest, be sonority and surface appeal that plays the crucial role. The post-Derincourt music is richer, not simply because of the additional perspectives created by historic allusion, but also because of the increasingly sophisticated attempts to find an audible sense of structural perspective. Smalley's works from the late 70s and after are the most likely to achieve a presence in the concert planners and CD producers' consciousness, assuming that he or she is relatively adventurous when it comes to living composers and not only concerned with big names on the one hand and the up-and-coming on the other. Early works such as the Missa Brevis, the Missa Parodias, Gloria Tibi Trinitas I, and Song of the Highest Tower contain much that compares favourably with the most celebrated of Smalley's slightly older English contemporaries in the 60s and early 70s, Davis and Birtwistle, and merit an airing by the choirs and instrumental ensembles that are considerably more polished today than the pioneers who gave the initial performances. But it is the later orchestral pieces, the Concertstück, the symphony, the concertos for piano and oboe, as well as those for cello and contrabassoon, and close to the edge, together with chamber music such as Accord, the Chopin-based works, and Crepuscule, which are the most deserving of attention. Just as it is possible for the visibility and reputation of established composers or any other kind of artist to discourage truly critical engagement, so it is possible to dismiss those that are not particularly well known simply because they are not particularly well known. While it has been my intention to demonstrate Smalley's compositional skill and inventiveness, this is an introductory book, and it may be that a more extended study by an author more removed from the composers temporally and personally is required before a fully rounded evaluation is possible. Nevertheless, it is my hope that this study might stimulate further interest in, and in particular further performances of, a body of music that I believe to be amongst the most coherent and engaging of the latter part of the 20th century. So, Roger now goes on to retirement, has gone on to retirement. With my outsider's hat on, I'm actually pleased to see him retire. It means that there's more time for composition. He's probably too young yet for a late period of some sort, but whatever he does, I'll be much looking forward to it and certainly devouring the scores, even if this does mean adding a few more chapters in a later edition to a book that has taken far too long to finish. I hope that my connection with Roger continues. He has one of the sharpest musical minds I've come across, one of the sharpest minds per se, in fact. Writing the book has been one of the biggest pleasures of my professional life, and Roger's been a very inspirational figure for me, and I'm sure he will continue to be so. So, here ends the eulogy.